Hello, welcome to the latest Vieunite Art in Focus podcast. My name's Benedict Carpenter Van Barthold, and I'm joined today by Reece Goodman. Reece, hi, how you doing?
Hello, I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. It's good to see you. And I think we're going to dive into abstract art today. Are you ready?
Yes, I think so.
Are you familiar with abstract art?
I know of it. I don't think I know anything about it.
I think one of the things that might be worth getting out of the way from the top is a definition. So if we're going to talk about abstract art, there are two things that we could spend the rest of our lives debating. And the first of those is, what is abstraction? And the other one is, what is art? So I'm going to park the art elephant right at the beginning. And for the sake of this conversation, let's just say art is painting, sculpture, leave it at that. It's actually, that could be the subject of a different podcast. We'll come back to that another day. So let's focus on the abstraction. Some definitions. Most art, if you think about it, is representational. It depicts something, it shows something you can recognize, a person or a landscape, etc. And sometimes that's called representational art, sometimes it's called figurative art, sometimes it's called naturalism. They've all got slightly different meanings from each other. So if something's naturalistic, it is trying, it's an attempt at depicting the world as it really is without there being any kind of convention involved. I don't think anyone's ever managed to do that, really. Figurative art normally shows a person. So the word is sometimes more loosely used to refer to anything which is representational. But for me, there's an implication that there's a person or people in it, maybe an animal rather than a person, much less so, let's say, a still life. Then there's representational art, and that is work that shows something nameable, some kind of nameable, recognizable object. Now, abstraction or abstract art is art that emphasizes the aesthetic values of form, color, and composition entirely separately from the appearance of a subject.
Right. And how is that graded? I know graded is a bad word, but what is the difference between me just drawing a squiggly line and saying that that is the form of whatever I say it is, and actually having abstract art?
So if you were to do that, I think another useful term to look at is non-objective art. So non-objective art is sometimes used as being a synonym for abstraction, but all of these words mean something quite specific, and often actually in art you'll find that they can mean very specific things to different people, so confusing territory. But if something's non-objective, it's got absolutely deliberately has no relation to any kind of nameable object. And that is not necessarily what abstraction means, or abstract art, because abstract art sometimes begins with something tangible or nameable in reality, and then moves away from that point. And I think we'll probably go on to see exactly what what that might mean if we start to think about some specific pieces of work, which we'll try to do in this podcast. But for now, let's say that abstract art is art that emphasizes color, form, composition, aesthetic values over capturing the natural appearance of a thing.
Mm-hmm. So would you say, from my understanding of art started off as people trying to represent things in the real world. I assume abstraction grew from a subgenre of art. Could you tell me a bit about what kind of era that was? Where did that come from? Who were the pioneers?
Yeah, sure. So I think actually you can see abstraction or abstract elements in most art, because I'm sure people will be able to think of counterexamples to this, but I think that only the most boring artist would make a painting the sole purpose of which was to actually kind of capture the natural likeness of a thing, and that only. So art is normally representation plus something else. And one way of thinking about abstraction is what is that other thing else? It's normally the way in which colours sit together.
The abstract art is just that. They've gotten rid of everything else.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way of thinking about it. But you invoked the idea of the origins of art, and I think you're right. A lot of very early art is an attempt to capture something which we know existed, like bison being hunted. But then, you'll probably seen as well the very famous images of caveman hands, which have been sort of stenciled around. And perhaps you can start to see a degree of abstraction in that, because they're not really painting the hand, they're painting the space around the hand, for one thing. And the thing that they're working from is from their body towards an image. And that is a degree of abstraction. You can't make art without there being some degree of abstraction, because if you were literally just creating an image of another thing that existed and there's no degree of abstraction, you'd have to be literally remaking that thing. It wouldn't be a representation at all. It would be a clone.
This reminds me, is this the painting that is a pipe, where it says this is a pipe? Is that a commentary on abstraction? Because the way you're talking is reminding me of that painting.
Yeah, so that painting, that's a very famous Magritte painting, Ceci n'est pas une pipe, this is not a pipe, it's a representation of a pipe, and he's drawing attention to that kind of phenomenon. But I don't think we should get stuck on that point. I think that for the purposes of the kind of like kicking off, let's think about abstraction as being something that isn't necessarily a rejection of reality, but that has the emphasis on colour, composition, form, and where the naturalism or naturalist representation might be less important.
Okay, so to go back then to what my question was, because I think we veered off a little bit. When did we start to see abstract art as we know it today? When did it start to emerge? I know there's abstract pieces in every art, but as a concept,
very early stages of the 20th century would be when the kind of mainstream of abstraction began in both painting and sculpture in a modern sense. So you might think of characters like Malevich in painting, or Brancusi in sculpture, and yeah, so we're looking at sort of 1915, around about then.
is there anything that kick-started it? I would like to dive deep a little bit about art eras and how they start and where they come from, because I assume the way the world is makes people think. So like TV shows that were predicting the future, like the Jetsons, that was a time in life where everyone was really hopeful about the future, and they were like, oh my god, the future's going to be like this, and so on. And then that kick-started an era of art that was representational of that time period. What could have happened that made artists turn to abstraction?
Well, I think in part a rejection of what they saw as the way in which painting at that time served a social hierarchy that they wanted to move away from. So if I'm thinking about Kazmir Malevich, who was a very famous Russian painter, I think he was Russian, in 1915, he created a very famous painting of a black square. And yeah, that's what it is. It's a painting of a black square on a, there are different versions of it, but the one I'm thinking of has got a white background around it. There are versions in different museums around the world. The most famous one's probably the Treachery Museum in Moscow, but there are other versions. And it's a really powerful statement because it's so starkly empty. And if you think about what painting looked like in 1915, it didn't look like that. It looked like very representational, like I suppose at the more radical fringe you get some social realist painting in France and in Germany, but there was nothing comparable to this. This is a 0 point. It's a new beginning. And his intention was to liquidate everything that came before it. It was a kind of statement of oblivion. It's a dark painting. There's it's like someone's turned the lights out on all of the art that preceded it, but it's also somehow quite sublime. There's a combination when I look at it of a lack of comprehension and a feeling of the sublime. It's a very starkly simple painting, and I don't think you can look at that painting in isolation from what was happening around it in the context of the Russian Revolution.
So, yeah, you bring up a point there. As someone that's not in the art world, if I go to a museum and I see a black square on a painting, my instinctive thought is, this isn't art, I could do this. Why is this so highly sought after? It sounds to me that what has given this painting the power that it has is the story behind it, and you're able to bring meaning out of that story. But if you strip back that story and the art history and everything about it, is there anything that makes it art? Because if I look at a really nice portrait of a field, and it's not a picture for picture, it's not like a like for like picture, but I can still see beauty in it. I don't need to know its history. What makes abstract art different? Do you need the story behind it? Is that the whole point?
Well, I think with art like Malevich's Black Square, which has made it around about the same time as another very provocative, probably more famous piece of work, which is Marcel Duchamp's Fountain, which is a urinal that's been turned onto its back and then signed Armat, which is a kind of pseudonym for the artist. Very, very controversial, provocative sculpture. It's a ready-made object. Literally, it's a urinal. That was made in 1917, so Black Square and the Fountain are belong at about the same period of time, and they're both provocative statements in the same way, and they're both deliberately trying to do something different. They're both saying, actually, like the way in which we've done art in the past is like, we're done with that, we're going to do something different. And they're conceptual gestures. They're like moves in a cultural and political game that are being made by artists who are absolutely plugged into the most current thinking. And that's part of the story behind it, because you kind of need to know that in order to appreciate it as art. But I think that if you know the story behind any object, even if it is, as you put it, a painting of a field, you're going to appreciate more, you're going to see more.
I fully agree. I mean, the point I was getting at more so is abstract art to me is less art and it's more a statement, a political statement, or it doesn't even have to be political. It's a conversation that the artist is trying to have with the viewer, whereas a painting of a field doesn't have to be that. I can just paint a pretty picture if I so wish. But if I'm going to convey a message, abstract art is a way of getting all of the fluff out of it. Like you said, it's just raw emotion, but you have to be part of that journey. And I think that's why people are so misunderstanding about it, because I could just draw the same square, but it wouldn't be as famous, and that's because there's no meaning behind it. I would just be drawing a black square.
Well, I mean, the other thing is that art rewards novelty. The first time a statement has been made, it's more interesting than the 20th time the statement's been made. But that you're touching on the common refrain that's made in relation to abstract art, which is the kid could have done that. My kid could have done that argument. That's not art. It requires no skill. That's a tricky one. I don't always look for what you could define as being craft skill in painting, because I don't think that that's the most interesting thing anyway. But if I think of a really provocative piece of abstract art, something like Twombly's Leda and the Swan, which is a large canvas and it's really quite scribbly. So it kind of, at one level, it kind of looks like a child's scribble. That's the kind of statement one might hear about a painting like this, because I think in part that reaction comes sometimes from people feeling like art galleries can feel quite judgy, right? And if you're not comfortable in an art gallery, then I think it's quite natural to go on the offensive, right? Which is what that statement does. That's just an unfortunate reflection, I think, of some aspects of how our society works. But it's certainly true that some abstract art can appear deceptively simple. But what you really need to understand when you're looking at art is that there is intentionality in it, and there are artistic choices that have been made. So when you accept that the artist who's done that painting is almost certainly capable of producing something that might look superficially more skilled, you've got to ask the question, why have they done that, and what is the gain from them doing that? So if you think about Twombly's Leda and the Swan painting, this big gestural, scribbly painting, you are being given clues, you're being given some ways in. First of all, there's quite often a title to the work, so what does that say? In this case, it's a reference to mythology. So this is the rape of Leda by Jupiter when he transformed himself into a swan. And once you know that, you can start to see things in the image which actually depict that kind of violent movement. Then some of the gestures start to take on a symbolic form. You can see phallic shapes, you can see heart shapes. It becomes more decipherable. And all of that's there. At the same time, you don't move away, you don't lose the sense of the artist's body because it's so gestural. So there's a kind of vigour about that painting that serves as a kind of metaphor for the subject as well, if you know what I mean. You can really get the sense of the artist at work making this thing, this kind of heavy, very laden painting.
It's so interesting that you say that. My next question was going to be, how would someone not in the art world appreciate abstract art? Because, like I said, if the meaning behind it is such an important factor, and I go into a museum, obviously you can get the audio headset and you can read the little plaque, but you're right in that the title, it sounds like art, not just this art, but any art, is kind of like a puzzle to be unpacked, and you need to find all the little clues everywhere, and a title is a huge part of the art and is often overlooked.
Yeah, sometimes I think that's very common, and I would always encourage people like to look at the painting first, not to go to the panel or to the audio guide. Just look at the painting first, because art is a form of non-verbal communication. That's what it's great at. It communicates without words and without written language. And with a painting like that one of Twombly's, if you look at it and think, that's a thing that's been made. It's been made by a person. It's a physical entity. You start to see the painting as a record of the artist's movement. It's like looking at a dance. You know, you can imagine yourself making those marks, and you appreciate the kind of vigour that would go into making it, the kind of gestural nature of that painting, which gives you access to the emotional intensity and the chaotic nature of the painting and the myth of, and that's how it's by using that skill that Twombly is able to talk about passion, violence, vulnerability in a way that seems so incredibly fresh, at the same time as being timeless. Because on a certain level as well, that painting does deliberately reference graffiti. You know, it deliberately references graffiti. There is something that, it is. Some of those marks have a history that comes from toilet walls. I mean, that's something that he's doing on purpose. It's part of the same thing. Or also, I think in his case, he was very interested in archaeology, so the sorts of sgraffito that you might see on an ancient building.
When was this made, sorry?
The painting was from the early 1960s, 1962, I think. And I think it's in New York now. I think it's at the Museum of Modern Art. I think that it's worth going back to the idea of the relationship between art and language is something that needs attention when we're thinking about abstract art, and particularly difficulties that people who aren't accustomed to looking at art might feel kind of embracing this apparently stupidly simplistic form of visual expression. We think of meaning as being something that you can explain, and if you can explain something, you're explaining it using words. That's kind of what we imagine. It isn't always, because if you imagine, You might want to show a child how to do something rather than go, oh, you tie your laces by taking the two and so, like, how would you verbally describe to a child how you're going to you just show them. But there is an idea, isn't there, that if we're in the realm of meaning, we're in the realm of language, we're in the realm of written language. And actually art is full of meaning, but most of the meaning that's in art doesn't translate very well into words. That's why it's visual art rather than literature. It translates into emotion and feeling.
Art. This happens in stories as well. You watch like English lessons of teachers talking about what was it, of mice and men, and how the red dress means this, but how do they know that that's what it means, other than the author saying, well, I did that for this reason? And in the same way, abstract art, how do we know that we're getting the meaning that was meant to be part of this piece?
Well, I don't know if you do know. I don't know if that's ever something that one can fully know, first of all. And I think you need to be comfortable with the idea that it's going to be an interpretation. So the question is it a valid interpretation or not, which is a different thing. That's not about being right or wrong. It's about making informed speculations or uninformed speculations. In the case of the painting that we're talking about at the moment, Twombly's Leda and the Swan, there are symbols in there that are conventional, like there are heart shapes, which, are common enough and have been common enough for long enough to know that that's a way of representing love. There are also phallus shapes which look like cocks, so, and everyone's seen that graffiti. So they're kind of like conventional symbols.
Can it be said that if it is up to interpretation, there's no stopping me becoming an artist? What is the barrier to entry then? If I want to do abstract art and I can put whatever meaning I want into it, but it doesn't matter because anyone can see their own meaning in my art. Why is it so hard? Why do we not see abstract art everywhere? All of these people coming into these museums saying this is so easy, I can do it. Why don't they do it? Why is there a barrier? Is there something that needs to be achieved?
Well, I think that people say that without actually then, as you've noticed, going ahead and doing it, because actually they probably know deep down they couldn't. That statement, my kid could have done that, is actually, well, talented child. Or maybe the statement's not accurate. It's one or the other. Just to pedal back a little bit on meaning and interpretation, you asked whether it was entirely arbitrary, and so what's the method for interpretation? In the interpretation of all visual art, not just abstraction, what an art historian or a critic would do would be to look at other sources that are made around about the same time as that artwork to see if they show an image like a piece of iconography or a symbol together with text in a way that they can point to and say, the use of this symbol in this painting from 1550 probably means, I don't know, fortune, because we've found the same symbol illustrating a poem about fortune that's published in this book. So that's the kind of method, and there's the study of that is called iconography, in its own particular branch of art history. The iconography in abstract art is often, but not always, different. I could mention at this stage perhaps one of the most famous abstract artists of all time, Jackson Pollock. Those big drippy Jack the Dripper, those big drippy paintings. There, I think, the artist's body is really important again, and it's kind of difficult to see any actual symbol in his work other than the symbol of movement. which is almost something you can reverse engineer by looking at it. Now, that's very, very different from the first painting we started talking about, which was Malevich's Black Square. And with that, it's not so much the painting, but I believe that if you have a look at how that painting was exhibited by the artist, it was in some shows, in some exhibits, it was hung in the corner of the room, literally in the corner, like at an angle, which is a very weird way of showing a painting. Until you learn, because I didn't know this, that was the way in which icons, religious icons, were quite often shown in Russian Orthodox homes.
As statues or as paintings?
Paintings.
Okay.
And he's deliberately referencing that in order to guide our reception of the painting. So this black square, which is like a kind of negation, if he's showing it in the same way as a piece of religious art is shown, that does shift our meaning. You start to realise that actually maybe this black square, this sublime black square, this unknowing thing, this thing that we can't penetrate is supposed to be understood in the same way as we would understand a relationship with God. So that is in the realm of iconography. It's a slightly unusual example. So yeah, those are ways. I think with abstract art, how do you know how to interpret it? First of all, just look at it, feel it. Don't be intimidated. Try and understand it, first of all, visually, by using your eyes. Then try and imagine making it, and you start to feel your body. It's a proprioceptive thing. And then maybe there are symbols in it which you can see. Those would all give you roots into it. But hang on to the idea of feeling something, because that's what the artist intends. They'll want you to feel something.
Can I throw you through a loop then with my next question?
Go for it.
As time progresses and new technologies come out, at the base of it, art, all different forms of art is the way in which you make it. You have sculptures that are made with clay. You have paintings that are made with a paintbrush or with a pencil or with a pen. You have photography now that you can take pictures. We now have digital art. I can make it on Photoshop. Is there a world in which digital art can be abstract? And if so, how would I feel that? If that makes sense. Is there any abstract digital art that come out in the art world?
We've got some in the Vieunite Art Library. There's some digital artworks that were made by one of our featured artists, Yuanyuan, who called Before the Origins of the Milky Way, series of digital artworks that are algorithmic, that call to my mind, again being guided by the title, a kind of celestial creation. They're abstract works for certain. You can't look at those and feel the body. You can't use your body as a way of that's not going to provide you with a route in to that work. It's work that was coded, actually. It's not algorithmic in the sense of being like AI. It's algorithmic in the sense of like an old-fashioned algorithm, like a program. And I think it's almost like a kind of visual sense, but perhaps there's also a kind of poetic sense you might have to use to think about the relationship between the code and the image and your interpretation of it that way. Certainly I can imagine digital abstract art. I think it would have a very different timbre. It would evoke a different sort of mood and a different feeling of relation to it. There's a lot of the artworks that I've described, so Jackson Pollock, Twombly, quite large scale things. A lot of abstract art was very, very big. If you think about the abstract expressionists, people like Mark Rothko, those are huge paintings. And in fact, there was a name for that, colour field painting, like a painting being the size of a field. You stand in front of it and you're surrounded by the colour. It's a sort of awesome thing. It's like being in a sunset. I suppose you could have a very large projection with the digital artwork, but and Refik Anadol makes very immersive pieces of work which have got elements of abstraction in them at the moment. Yeah, there are digital artists that work in that way.
Would you say that, have you been to, is it Liverpool Street Station, when you go outside and you have that massive digital projection? Is that abstract art?
I don't know what you're referring to. I thought you were going to ask me about Richard Serra's sculpture outside Liverpool Street Station.
Oh, no. I think it's Liverpool Street that I'm thinking of. If you don't know, then you don't know. But
I haven't been to the station for a while.
Oh, no, fair enough. Well, we'll just have to move on, though. You walk outside and there's this room. It's basically an outdoor room, but you look up and there's 4 walls and a ceiling that are entirely covered by projection, and it's on loop all day, every day, but it's a different... It's quite impressive. I recommend going.
Yeah, I have to check it out.
Okay, so I had another question as well that I had written down while you were talking about all of that. Would you say that abstract art requires meaning to be abstract? Am I able to make a piece that is abstract, that is purely aesthetic for the sake of being aesthetic?
Yeah, I think that would be fine. But then if you did that, inevitably people would feel something. Even if it's a feeling of deep satisfaction.
But that's, I mean, yeah, feeling, but that's different to meaning, right?
I'm not sure it is. I think that, so again, it's like what you're doing there is, I think, what we discussed earlier on, where you want to know almost factually how something resolves. And that's rarely the case with art. So you rarely get a kind of like the correct interpretation of this piece of work is blah. And then that's it. That's the end of the... Because art's generous. Art gives and gives and gives and gives. And part of what it gives is unexpected, even to the artist. And the meaning of an artwork changes every time it's looked at, every time it's seen. And it gets built on by critics and interpreters and other artists and gallerists. It gets added to. Artworks acquire meaning with age and time. It's part of their story. They almost have independent lives. Reece, I've given lots of really blokey artists for you to look at. I've talked about Twombly, Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Kazmir Malevich, and there's something quite blokey about that particular set, particularly characters like Rothko and Pollock. And I feel like we haven't paid any attention to perhaps a broader kind of abstraction, and also the very many female artists that there are that work in this way. And actually, one of the very first questions that you asked was, when did it start? And I started talking about Malevich and the Russian Revolution. But do you know what? There's a sort of secret history of abstraction, which has only recently been discovered, that goes back a little bit into the Victorian period and was pioneered particularly by a Swedish artist called Hilma af Klint. Now, her work wasn't discovered until, she was known about, but it wasn't properly shown until relatively recently. I think it was possibly in the 1980s that her work was discovered. And part of that reason was because she stipulated that her work should not be shown publicly until 20 years after her death. And I can't remember off the top of my head when she died. I think it was during the Second World War. So the earliest it could have been shown would have been the mid-60s. And she was a spiritualist. She was a Swedish, so not Victorian, it's not quite the right description, but 19th century spiritualist who used her interest in spirituality and the occult and scientific observation to create her art. And she was a member of a small group called the Five, who were women artists who held seances, and they sought to communicate with spiritual beings. And these experiences were channeled through her painting. It's really extraordinary. increasingly abstract work. So her early work was quite traditional, representational landscapes, portraits, but they got increasingly abstract and modern looking, actually, very modern looking. And they started to reflect her interest in theosophy and sort of esoteric Christianity. She was also a very early adopter of something called automatic drawing, which is a technique that was pioneered by the Surrealists, where you kind of let your subconscious guide your hand. But she was doing this in the late 1890s. So that's like 30 years before the Surrealists were doing it. And I probably should have started my story with her rather than Malevich. But Malevich is much more part of the like conventional story of art with capital letters, you know, because he was a mainstream artist and always was, even as a radical. He's part of that sort of narrative. Whereas Hilma af Klint had this sort of esoteric beginning. She had her hidden art. It was then sort of discovered in the 1980s. And obviously by the 1980s, we'd turned Malevich into the story. And there are lots of other female artists who have, you know, challenged the canon in similar ways. I could, you know, think of painters like Helen Frankenthaler in the 1950s, who was associated with the abstract expressionists, but where there's an entirely different kind of lyricism in her work that you don't get in the kind of perhaps slightly bombastic painting of people like Mark Rothko. So, I mean, perhaps at some point we could go back and have a deeper dive on some of that territory, but you know, the history of abstract art is a rich one, and it's one that's still being discovered and uncovered, even as artists are still working in an abstract way. But I hope that's helped, Reece, in terms of answering some of your questions.
No, definitely. Was it ever discovered why she wanted to hide it for 20 years?
I don't know. Probably. I don't know very much about her.
It's very interesting.
Her work. I'm guessing that part of the reason is because it was so connected to her religious beliefs and occult practices.
So, yeah, that makes sense.
And some of it might have been made in association with other people. I mean, through seances and such like. But I'm busking. I'm speculating.
I see.
So I don't know, I'm afraid. But as I said, I don't know her paintings very. I've seen several of them as stunning artworks. But
well,
I have, yeah.
We'll link to all of the artworks, all that we can in the description. So if anyone's interested in any of these art, obviously a bunch of the art that has been spoken about today is on the Vieunite app. It's being displayed behind me. So I'd highly encourage going on the app just to explore art as if you're in a museum, learn a little bit, feel a little bit. Is there any pieces on the app that you'd recommend people search for, try to find? Any of these?
Well, I mentioned Yuanyuan. I think check her out. It's a contemporary artist who's made some abstract works, digital abstraction, as you mentioned. And I love the Monet paintings you've picked, some of which are on display behind you. So, Reece, I hope you feel more confident looking at abstract art now.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and it's about, remember, I mean, I think, look at it, feel it, respond to it. And you know what, as I've been talking, I think I've got an action point, which is, let's learn a bit more about Hilma af Klint and see if we can find some of her work to add to the Vieunite Art Library and share it with the wider public. There'll be, you know, all of the other works which we've mentioned we can link to in the show notes. Do go onto the app and have a dive through our collection yourselves. But as we've been talking, I think, it would be really great to see if we could get some of Hilma af Klint's work in the library. So I'm going to give that a go.
Okay. there you go. You got that to look forward to. Check back on our socials to see when that happens.
Yeah.
But yeah, like Ben said in the description, all of the pieces that we were talking about. Obviously, I assume the editor has been putting them up on screen as we've been talking, so you can have a little look at those as well. But great, that's been great. Thank you so much for educating me, Ben, talking to me about abstract art. Hopefully, we can have many more discussions on many more topics in the future.
Yeah, I'll look forward to it, Reece. It's good to see you, and let's catch up again soon on a different subject.
Brilliant. All right, see you guys.
Take care.